Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 36, episode 9, Australian Bravery in the Vietnam War, part 2. This episode was written by Murray Dahm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. Australia's involvement and commitment to the Vietnam War continued until 1973, when the last remaining platoon, who were acting as guards for the Australian Embassy in Saigon, were withdrawn in June 1973. As with American involvement, Australia's contribution also escalated over time. Following the arrival of the AATTV in 1962, in August 1964, Royal Australian Airforce, RAAF, began to run supply missions to Vung Tau, the port south of Saigon. By the end of 1965, the US had 200,000 troops in the country and had requested further assistance from its allies. Australia dispatched the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, to serve alongside the US 173rd Airborne Brigade, the Sky Soldiers, in Bien Hoa Province, just outside Saigon. During the Tet Offensive from January 1968, Bravery and Nui Dat were once again targeted, but these attacks were repulsed. By 1969, however, opposition to the war and conscription in Australia was growing. A Don't Register campaign to dissuade young men from registering for conscription grew. By August 1969, public opinion in Australia had turned decisively against the war. A Gallup poll that month found 55% of those questioned favoured bringing Australian troops home, and only 40% favoured they remain. This was the first poll to have less than 50% approval for the war. It was in this context, however, that Australia's final 2 Victoria Crosses in the Vietnam War were announced, both for actions in May 1969, gazetted in late August and September 1969. On May 6, 1969, Warrant Officer Class 2 Ray Simpson May was serving as an advisor in the AATTV in Kon Tum province in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. He was serving as the commander of the 232nd Mobile Strike Mike Force Company of the 5th Special Forces Group on a search and clear operation near the border with Laos. One of the platoons became heavily engaged with the enemy, and Simpson personally led the remainder of the company to the assistance of his engaged platoon. His citation stated that, disregarding the dangers involved, he placed himself at the front of his troops, thus becoming a focal point of enemy fire, and personally led the assault on the left flank of the enemy position. As Simpson led the attack, another of his platoon commanders and a fellow warrant officer was seriously wounded. This also caused the attack to falter. Under enemy fire, Simpson moved across open ground to the wounded warrant officer and then carried him to safety. He then returned to his company and, with complete disregard for his safety, he crawled forward to within 10 metres of the enemy and threw grenades into their positions. Dark fell and the enemy remained in place. Simpson ordered the withdrawal of the company, and he covered the withdrawal, throwing smoke grenades and personally carrying the wounded warrant officer to safety. According to his citation, his leadership and personal bravery in this action were outstanding, but this would not be the only action for which he was cited. Rainey Ray Simpson, also known somewhat typically as Simo, born in Redfern, Sydney in 1926, and when his mother abandoned the family, he was raised in a Church of England home for boys. He would remain a devoted Anglican. He enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in March 1944, and his Second World War service saw him on Morotai, Tarakan, Borneo, and Rabaul, and New Guinea. He was demobilised in 1947, but joined the Australian Regular Army in January 1951, and later that year he deployed to Korea with 3 RAAF. He was promoted to sergeant in February 1953 and returned to Australia in 1954 before being deployed once more to Malaya with 2 RAR in 1955 to 1957. He then joined the 1st Special Air Service Company based outside of Perth in Western Australia. In July 1962 he was promoted to Warrant Officer Class 2 and was among the first 30 advisors sent to Saigon as part of the AATTV. Back in Sydney, in July 1963 he enlisted in a second AATTV tour in 1964. In September that year his patrol was ambushed by the Viet Cong, and despite being severely wounded in the leg, he rallied his men and led them in repelling enemy assaults until reinforcements could arrive. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for this action. He recuperated from his injury in Tokyo before returning to Australia in June 1965. In January 1966 he was posted to the 1st Commando Regiment, but then requested to be discharged from the army that May. Simpson could often appear shy when in company, and yet others reported that he was direct and blunt. He was even called rude, mischievous, and exasperating, yet he was also completely free of pretension and a man of simple need, devoted to his Japanese wife, who he had married in January 1953. Following his bravery on May 6th, during the same operation, on May 11th, Simpson's battalion commander was killed and another warrant officer wounded. Another warrant officer had become separated from the majority of his troops due to enemy fire. Simpson took control of the situation and led 2 platoons to where the enemy was. Coming under heavy fire themselves, most of the men fell back, except for those immediately around Simpson. His citation stated that, disregarding his own safety, he moved forward in the face of accurate enemy machine gun fire in order to cover the initial evacuation of the casualties. He oversaw the wounded being moved out of the line of enemy fire, all the while being put under fire himself from close range. His citation continues, "At the risk of almost certain death, he made several attempts to move further forward towards his battalion commander's body, but on each occasion he was stopped by heavy fire. He realized that the position was untenable and that his priority should lie in extricating the other casualties as quickly as possible. While still under enemy fire, Simpson therefore covered the withdrawal of the wounded alone by deliberately placing himself between the enemy and the wounded. From this position he continued to fight and prevented the enemy from advancing. Simpson's gallant and individual action and his coolness under fire were exceptional and were instrumental in achieving the successful evacuation of the wounded to the helicopter evacuation pad." The citation ends with the summary of Simpson's bravery, stating his repeated acts of personal bravery in this operation were an inspiration to all Vietnamese, United States, and Australian soldiers who served with him. His conspicuous gallantry was in the highest tradition of the Australian Army. Simpson was gazetted for his Victoria Cross on August 24th, 1969, and received his medal from Queen Elizabeth II in person at Government House, Sydney, on May 1st, 1970. Simpson was then discharged from the Army for the final time in May 1970. He had, by that time, become the longest-serving member of the AATTV and had been enlisted and involved in conflicts around the world for a quarter of a century. He retired with his wife to Tokyo, where he took up a position at the Australian Embassy, but died of cancer there in October 1978. He is buried in the Yokohama War Cemetery. Also in May 1969, Warrant Officer Class 2 Keith Payne was the commanding officer of another Mite Force, the 212th Company 1st Mobile Strike Force, which was also operating in Kon Tum Province near its base at Bent's Camp. His patrol was attacked by a North Vietnamese force of superior strength. The two leading companies, one of which was Payne's, were isolated, and the enemy surrounded them on three sides, assaulting them with heavy mortar and rocket fire. The troops began to fall back, but Payne, directly exposing himself to the enemy's fire, held off enemy assaults, all but alone by firing his weapon and then running from position to position, as well as collecting grenades and throwing them at the assaulting enemy. In doing this, he was wounded in the hands, head and arms with the shrapnel fragments from a grenade, and, despite his efforts, the men under his command gave way. The battalion commander, along with several advisors and more troops, were also forced to withdraw due to the pressure of the enemy fire. Ignoring his own wounds, Payne covered this withdrawal by throwing grenades and firing his weapon at the advancing enemy. Under fire, he ran across open ground to head off his own company, who were withdrawing in disorder. He halted the men, mostly Montagnard, and successfully organised the remnants of his and the second company into a temporary defensive perimeter. This was achieved by nightfall. In the darkness, Payne, of his own accord and at great personal risk, moved outside the perimeter into the darkness alone to find more wounded and other indigenous soldiers. Haynes said to one of his men, the enemy was still occupying their positions, and Payne crawled back towards it and successfully extricated several wounded soldiers. Altogether, he retrieved 40 wounded and lost soldiers. These actions took 3 hours. All the while, Payne was under occasional enemy fire. Returning to his defensive perimeter, he discovered that the battalion had pulled back, and, undeterred, he led his command and the wounded through the now enemy-held territory to the safety of his battalion base at Ben Het. His citation surmises that his sustained and heroic personal efforts in this action were outstanding and undoubtedly saved the lives of a large number of his indigenous soldiers and several of his fellow advisors. Warrant Officer Payne's repeated acts of exceptional personal bravery and unselfish conduct in this operation were an inspiration to all Vietnamese, United States and Australian soldiers who served with him. His conspicuous gallantry was in the highest traditions of the Australian Army. Born in Ingham, far north Queensland, in 1933, Keith Payne was taught to hunt and fish by his father. He also sold tropical fruit to American servicemen during the Second World War. He left school at 14 and enlisted in the Citizens Military Force, now the Australian Army Reserve, but then enlisted in the Australian Regular Army in 1951, when he was 18. In July 1952 he joined 1st RAAF and was deployed to Japan as part of a reinforcement force for troops in Korea. He was deployed to Korea in September and served there until March 1953, and returned to Australia in August. He married in 1954 and was promoted to corporal in 1955. He was promoted to sergeant in 1961 and deployed to Malaya in 1963, where he served for almost 2 years, returning to Australia in February 1965. In February 1967, he was posted to Papua New Guinea and was promoted to Warrant Officer Class 2 in May. In February 1969, he was appointed to the AATTV and sent to Vietnam. Payne was later asked if he was scared during the encounter. He replied, "My God, yes, I was." As recently as 2017, he said of his actions, "You have a responsibility, and my responsibility was, I was the company commander, and it was my responsibility to look after my soldiers. And basically that's all that happened, but it happened under very arduous circumstances. You either accept the responsibility, or you bloody well don't." In September 1969, Payne was evacuated home to Brisbane, suffering from an illness, but received a hero's welcome. In the wider context of the public's opinion turning against the war, this reception is all the more remarkable. He had recovered by November and was posted to the Royal Military College, Duntroon, as an instructor. Payne's Victoria Cross was gazetted in September 1969. The same month he arrived in Brisbane, and he received his medal in person from Queen Elizabeth II on board the Royal Yacht Britannia of Brisbane in April 1970. This, although his action took place after Simpson's and he was gazetted later than Simpson too, he received his medal first. He retired from the Australian Army in 1975, but then enlisted as a captain in the Army of the Sultan of Oman during the Dhofar War in 1975 to 1976, thinking that it remained necessary to fight the threat of communism. After returning to Australia in 1976, he became active in veterans' affairs, especially in post-traumatic stress disorder counselling. Payne himself had suffered trauma for many years. Because of his service, his sleep was interrupted, he drank excessively, and he became short-tempered. His sons began to avoid him until his wife told him he risked losing his family. From that point on, he turned his life around. He has been awarded both the Medal of the Order of Australia, OAM, in 2006 and made a member of the Order of Australia in 2015 in recognition for his services to veterans' affairs. Any repair that recognition of Simpson's and Payne's bravery may have brought in 1970 was soon undone by the decision in April to expand the war into neutral Cambodia. That month, South Vietnamese forces were ordered to cross the border, and the resulting turmoil led to the Khmer Rouge seizing power in the country in 1975. This resulted in a growing anti-war movement in the US and in Australia, led to the moratorium marches in 1970 and 1971, which saw 200,000 people march against the war around the country. Australia had already begun to scale back its support. In November, 8 RAAF was withdrawn from 1 ATF and not replaced. At the same time, however, the numbers of AATTV advisors was increased. 1971 saw the withdrawal of further troops and all air units. The last battalion was withdrawn from Newdat on November 7th. The last advisors left in December 1972. Australia's involvement in the wars was declared at an end in January 1973, leaving only the embassy guards who were withdrawn in June, when the Communist North launched its major offensive against the South in 1975. RAAF Hercules aircraft did fly humanitarian missions to aid civilians and evacuate orphans, as well as evacuating embassy staff on April 25th. Payne, now 89, is one of only 8 living Victoria Cross recipients. The oldest is Second World War veteran 103-year-old John Cruikshank. Payne's is also now one of only 2 recipients awarded for actions performed during the 20th century. Nepalese Gurkha Rambadur Limbu, who was awarded the Victoria Cross during the Indonesian confrontation in 1965, died in April 2023. 4 of the other recipients, however, have received either the Victoria Cross for Australia or the Victoria Cross for New Zealand. And the 2 remaining British Victoria Cross recipients, Johnson Bahari and Joshua Leakey, were awarded their medals for action in Iraq and Afghanistan. Payne, then, remains a fierce reminder of the bravery of so many Australians during the Vietnam War, and, along with his 3 Australian Victoria Cross colleagues, a sobering reminder of the bravery and sacrifice which the Victoria Cross represents. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.